can remember you lecturing people about how it has to be this way, and you can't raise children if you don't, you know, they have to understand this. Remember, you lecture people about.
I'm still bad about that. Yeah. And one of my theories, and it's the same theories that we developed in college. They've just been, I hope, refined a little bit. But the idea is if you start an architectural line, no matter what, a door jamb or a roof plane or whatever, you follow it till it can't continue anymore without disrupting things. That's to me is an essence of that's why the doors go from floor to ceiling, the windows do the same thing. I hate those windows that are cut as holes in the walls or doors. 99% of the doors in the world, I guess, go up, over, and down in a hole cut out of a wall plane instead of being a plane in a plane.
Right.
And that you know, it's a simple thing, but it sets me apart a little bit. There are a few people that do like that. I believe the same. Yeah.
That's pretty.
That's over there on Melrose. Joe Deal, I'll be darned, I didn't know he was the manager.
Is it still there?
Yeah, it's still there.
Does it still look the same?
Yeah. Well, it's no longer the Third National Bank.
Something else, yeah.
They've merged.
It's really the first building I designed in 1959, and as a matter of fact, it happened to win first prize in the 1960 AIA contest. It really sort of set the tone for the body of work that I've done throughout my career, in that I tried for very simple forms, very strong forms, but very, I like to think, using elegant materials in a very understated way. What the building really is a study of planes in space, of simple proportions, materials, the solid versus the void. The clear story going all the way around is a completed form. Basic form is still there, simple, straightforward, and I like to think fairly bold. This is the international headquarters for the United Paper Workers. They're out of United States, Canada, and I think Mexico. And anyway, it's a union headquarters. And it was meant to be a very building that would reflect the fact that it was an international headquarters. So it was supposed to be a very prominent building on the skyline. The very fact that it's on a high hill made it a foreground building. That in the program as well. Throughout my career, I've thought that concrete was the material of our time. That it was the kind of material that you could sculpt and mold, and it would take on whatever form you chose to make it. So it was potentially a good sculptural material, and also it was a material that was unique to the 20th century. We'd had brick, of course, since the Egyptians, and steel and glass and all the rest, but concrete as an architectural structural element is really a 20th century innovation. We chiseled away the surface of the concrete so you can see the actual stones that make the thing work. Concrete is an admixture of cement and water and rough stones and little stones, and all of them have to be in the right kind of proportion for the thing to be structurally stable. Oh boy, that was beautiful, if I do say so. As you move around the building seems to have a rhythm. John Ruskin said that architecture is frozen music, and this is the closest I've ever come. Never forget, one day, about like today, it was early in February, I guess, I took my father out there to see it, and I was so glad because he lived about another 30 days after that, but he got to see the geometry come together and could understand the way the thing was designed, and so I'm very, very happy. That was a very important moment in my life. The building, it was interesting because the president of the union, Wayne Glenn, wanted his office and the whole thing. He said, I want the office to be as impressive as anything there is. I want the president of the United States, if he comes there, I want him to say, oh, wow. And so that was part of the problem, to make impressive structure and space.
President Young's on the phone, but he was going to come down in a second.
Good morning, Neil Bass.
Neil, I'm Boyd Young.
Glad to know you, Mr.
Good to
Brown.
know you. I tell you, we're really proud of our building, and we get a lot of compliments on it.
Wonderful. I hope it's been a good, serviceable building for you.
It has been. It has really been.
And we were talking about the purpose of the building is to sort of make a statement about the importance of your union.
It is, and that's exactly what it does.
And it's more than just an office structure.
Al Gore come by, and he just praised the building, and we have CEOs of some of the largest companies in the world come by, and they're impressed. This is a grand office.
Wayne Glenn, you know, he said, as a matter of fact, he told me, he said, when the President of the United States comes in here, I want him to say, okay.
Well, Al Gore, I was going to tell you what he said. He come in and he said, I wish I had an office like this. And I said, well, you are working on it, aren't you, Mr. Vice President?
Yeah. There's the Andrew Jackson. Now that's important, and it was so funny because there's a picture of the model
For Andrew Jackson.
And the idea was that the tour buses come a lot. You know, a lot of people come on tour buses. So, and they leave their engine on the whole time and putting out that carbon monoxide, which is polluting, and it was damaging the mansion. So I had to put the tour buses at one end where the prevailing breeze would blow all that stuff away. But the mansion was way over there, so the design became a very linear, long sort of path, but I tried to make it not seem long.
Was it driven by those tour buses?
It was driven by the tour buses, and also I wanted people to come in. They used to come in the back door.
Right, which
but
is
I wanted
not
to come in through the guitar-shaped gallery that Andrew Jackson himself had. But I remember Cece Reed, who was the chairman of the building committee, there she is in the picture with Lamar Alexander.
Oh, she looks the same.
When we put stakes in the ground, and she said, "You mean the building goes from here to there?"
It's hard to.
And I said, "Yeah, it does." She said, "It's too big," and I said, "It has to be that big." But anyway, that was funny. That was funny.
Oh my goodness.
The RV parking lot is way over there, so they, as you can see, the tour buses let people off here, then they go over there and park, and the breeze blows the fumes away that way. So the big deal is, the first thing you see is restrooms. Been on the tour bus for 3 hours.
Very beautiful.
Thank you.
It's really a tribute to you.
You notice that there's no gutters or downspouts. The gutter is built into a trough inside the fascia, and the downspouts go out of sight below that. And so that was one of the things that was very controversial, very expensive. But I wanted a limestone cap, once again, to be military and presidential and very formal, to have an unconventional profile to that to the edge of all the pavilions, and that's what we have. We had a watercolor commission, Rachel's Garden, with the flowers out of Rachel's Garden, and I had it go around the corner, and people had never seen that before, and I said, well, why not? So you'll see it, a watercolor stretched around the corner down here. I worked really hard on the detailing of the serving line to try to keep the theme of the building with the bronze and the red and the brass, even to the little waste disposal containers, all custom designed.
White beans? I'll put them in a little bowl for you.
Here's one of the waste paper, the waste paper and tray things. Every little thing had to be designed. There's the watercolor that goes around the corner. Thank you. Well, you can see the organization of the design, the bathrooms, the gift shop, and the restaurant over on this side, the free stuff. And then you come on in, and then you have to pay to get into the museum and historic house. But the theater is a room that seats about, I guess it seats about 100, and has a nice little screen that's built in. That came out of Cheekwood, the little design going down the screen, but it's a 14-minute film on Jackson. But the main thing out here is I think the progression to organize the traffic so that you don't seem like it's a long walk from this point of getting off the bus to going into the museum. But anyway, the museum, to the house. The museum is of some interest because in the floor, I've designed a floor pattern that is repeated in the steel ceiling so that when the curator wants to change exhibits, they can line up the floor and the ceiling and all the panels are going to be vertical. So that's a nice thing about that, and that's one thing I wanted to show you.
Yeah, this is a great place to be. The environment is wonderful.
It's a privilege to work on it.
Yeah, the environment itself is wonderful. Yeah, it is, and it's getting better all the time.
There's a center line right here, and everything on that side is matched by everything on this side. And I'll never forget the young man in my office that was working on it. We realized that the thing was some few inches off. And he said, nobody will ever know the difference. And I said, stop, we'll start all over because it's got to be perfect. And so this side matches that side exactly. People have their names on the brick that gave contribution in Clarendon on one of them. This is a Ralph E.W. Earl painting of Jackson and of Rachel. And Earl, of course, is a master. And we're lucky to have several of his paintings here at the Visitor Center. This is a Robinson Neal Bass attempt at graphic design right here, and whatever success or failure is illustrated by this plaque right here. But I had to make sure that all the visitors approached the mansion through the grove of majestic trees to see the house the way Jackson originally had it planned. So that's the walkway out through the trees into the mansion. Here we are at the Lee Rose Residence for Senior Citizens. One of my buildings, I think it's was finished in 1970, and one thing that I think is somewhat significant, it's the same federal budget, same amount of money that was allocated for it as some of the rather dull similar buildings over on the skyline that just brick boxes. This one I think has a little more character, and the concrete, architecture concrete, is a strong, never need to be any maintenance done to it material. The whole idea here was to try to make a building that was, even though it was big, that the scale was easy to handle visually, and the materials were, I thought, strong architectural materials, and it made a strong silhouette against the sky. I don't know, when you see it from afar, the top of it looks pretty good. It's not cluttered up with a lot of junk on top, and I like to think of it as a piece of sculpture. To get a site for this big of a building and still have a lot of grounds around it is somewhat difficult. Well, Ferris Deep, who was head of the Planning Commission in those days, worked with Lee Rose and me, and we changed this whole street, made it into Magnolia Boulevard, and that allowed us to have this open area to develop for this building. The other funny thing about it, one funny thing, was that I worked on the building for 6 or 7 months without any pay, and we didn't know whether the federal government would fund it or not. So I remember one time flying down to Atlanta, where the HUD office was at those days, and someone asked me, said, what would happen if we didn't build it? And I said, well, the first thing, the architect would go bankrupt. Lee Rose Worthen was the one who gave the seed money. They had to have the Senior Citizens Organization needed to have some seed money before HUD would even consider the application for the loan. And she wanted to be somewhat identified with the building, but since there was Worthen this and Worthen that at Vanderbilt, she thought it would be more appropriate just to call it the Lee Rose, which the first two names of her name. And this Worthen's still on the board and still president of the organization. I'm still on the board. Of all things, I'm treasurer, which I don't think they made a very wise choice, but nevertheless, I'm treasurer. And I have to read the treasurer's report in every board meeting, and it's always astonishing to me that it's all laid out for me. All I have to do is read it. I'm well known as the miser of Chickering Court. My mother grew up right across the street at 1905 Ackland Avenue. That's where her mother and father lived, and when I was a little kid, I used to play there a lot, and I remember every night when I kind of put my car in the garage, I remember going with my grandfather after he'd make his nightly rounds. He was a physician. We'd put the car in the garage together, and that was right across the street. So that was very nice, very nostalgic to be able to work in the same neighborhood. People that live here have to be at least 62. And so it's important to me, and I'm sure to make their so-called, now that I'm 76, their declining years as attractive as possible, to make the ambience as comfortable, and I like for them to think that they see some quality design here, and that's bound to rub off on their personalities, I like to think, and make them have a richer, more fulfilled experience in their latter years. So I've always been interested in housing for the elderly. This is the second of 3 of them that we've done, and I think the most successful. I think at the top of my game as far as housing goes. And the floor plan is very simple. There's a core right in the middle for the elevators and the fire stairs, and then the units go all the way around, so that the corridor is not long and linear like they are in the other buildings. The elevator's in the middle and you have this long corridor. Here we have an elevator in the middle, but a square donut corridor. None of the other buildings have this feature. We kind of squeezed it in. It's a walk-around area, undercover, so that the people who live here can take their exercise without fear of weather or having their purses snatched or anything like that. And that's a pretty nice feature. 13 times around is a mile, and they can go in at midpoint all the way around. I got the idea from my mother and father who lived in Washington, and they were in their, I guess, late 70s, a little bit afraid to walk around in the area at night or after supper because of the muggings that were going on. So we thought it would be nice if we could provide a secure and pleasant environment so that the occupants of the building could get their exercise and get a nice view too. It's a pretty nice view, as you can see behind me, and off to the south is Green Hills and all that. So it's not too unattractive an environment, and so that was a bonus that we managed to get in. whole idea of my coming back to Nashville for a career was to give back something to the community. I've always wanted to do that, and this is one small effort in that direction. I thought it was more important to me personally to come back to Tennessee than to work in Ohio or someplace like that, California, where just my roots are here, and there's a great love I have for the state and for this area. So everything I've done, I've tried to keep that in mind. Here we are at the Botanic Hall at Cheekwood, and I'll never forget the interview that we underwent while they were choosing the architect. And I was really a long shot. When we had the interview over at a person's house, I said, you know, this is the first building that you've done on this campus since 1930 when the Cheeks built the mansion up here. And it strikes me as being very important that you do something not timid, but really substantial, and that it's going to set the tone of the quality for future work from here on in. That little sentence probably got me the job. I wanted to make sure of several things. One is that it related, of course, to the growing world. It's a botanic hall, so it has to, it's involved with things growing, and so the building had to somehow be compatible with the forces of plant world, and that's where one of the curvilinear motifs took its root, no pun intended there. The idea was that in nature, most of the things you see have curves in them, and gentle curves and beautiful curves, and I wanted to make sure that this building radiated that idea. And the second part of that equation is that I wanted to relate to the mansion very strongly. And as I experienced the architectural experience of walking through the mansion, I was stunned by how many curvilinear forms are there too. A major spiral staircase is probably the dominant entrance element in the whole thing. And there are a lot of arches and niches that have curved tops. And so that fell right into place, that the curves would be appropriate for relating to the mansion and also to the botanic world of botanic things. And the second thing was that the building, because it is of nature, of plants and things of that kind, I wanted it to hunker down into the ground, to look as if it had grown, I hate to use the word organic that Frank Lloyd Wright used a lot, but same idea, that the building was wedded to the ground and grew out of the ground. And then following that idea and looking again at the mansion where the gray limestone is the predominant color, it occurred to me that, well, of course the building has to be gray, and the limestone, well, that's okay, but maybe let's go to a more contemporary approach, and I'm back again to the concrete. It's hard for me to get away from the beauty of concrete. I love it because it takes the form of whatever you want it to take. It's a plastic form. In other words, you build the form, pour the concrete in there, and that's the way it comes out. It's not something you buy off the shelf. The other thing is that the rock that holds the cement together can be expressed and exposed, which we've done in most of the buildings and certainly here, and that's an integral part of the structure of the thing. So it's the integrity of the structure material is evident, and I really like that. And the third thing was that I wanted the experience of the entrance to come in and come into a sort of a whole new world that people would be find attractive and exciting, at the same time tranquilizing. So we tried to make the shapes gentle, and you'll notice that when you come in high and then walk down a gentle ramp and then come back into the display hall. One of the ideas of the ramp going down is to descend further down into the earth a little bit. You get the idea that you're close into the earth, and that's part of the plant syndrome as well. You have the entrance and then the nave, and then finally down to the altar. So it's a system of a path of the foot and the eye, where you have a beginning, a middle, and then a fruition. The arrival at the display hall in this building, you have a sense of completed journey. And it looks like they're getting ready to have a reception in here, but you can see once again how the curves focus back, put your eye to focus back on the stage and the window into the garden room. So it's a continuum of space. I like to think it's one spatial experience that has parts to it. That old tree was there, of course, when we built the building. I think that looks pretty good. Rather than have it just come down straight, I'm a groove freak, I guess. You'll notice the same thing in my house. When the fascia gets ready to hit a column, it tucks in. It just doesn't go right straight into it. Used to call that in school a sensitive intersection. Once again, you'll notice almost oriental proportions. The first and third things match, and the second is it's a Palladian kind of aesthetic where all three are not equal. And then vertically, it's the same thing. You have the higher and then the less high, and then the even less high on the third. So it's a study in proportional relationship between the forms. And I want to make sure, in all my buildings, I want to make sure that the structure is predominant and the non-structural elements are voids. The one that's the most poignant and relevant, I think, was there at Peabody when they asked me to do that building it was an addition. Actually, the Human Development Laboratory was an addition to the existing psychology building, which was an old Greek Revival building, Georgian whatever, Greek Revival. But I went inside to look at it, and I was appalled at how filthy the corridors were and how it needed paint, and Peabody didn't have much money then, and it was a miracle they got this money to build these buildings. What it was a grant from the Kennedy Foundation. You know, one of the Kennedy children was mentally retarded. And so the Kennedys gave them $3 million, with which they got a matching grant from the National Institutes of Health. So they ended up with $6 million to build 2 buildings with, and I got one of them. The purpose of it is to see what can be done through study and through different procedures to accelerate the learning, or to make sure that the children who are involved are not left behind. They have a play area out here where they've got cameras, and they observe the children and observe their habits and how they can be understood better and how they can be enriched. It's primarily, it's called human development, and it's an enrichment program for these disadvantaged children. Dr. Robb said, he said, congratulations on this new commission, but I want you to know that the building has to conform to all the existing campus aesthetic, and it has to be Georgian. And I said, got it. And so we came in with the model. There's a picture of the model here later. And he said, I thought I told you it had to be Georgian. And I said, Dr. Robb, it is Georgian in principle. It's just those principles are translated into a contemporary aesthetic. The same scale, the same brick, the same proportions as Georgian would have. And so when he presented it to the board of Peabody, they said, Felix, that's his name, Felix, I thought you told us the building was going to be Georgian. He said, it is. It's just, it was wonderful. That was one of the great experiences of my life. Human Development Laboratory at Peabody and now Vanderbilt. It was built in 1964, I believe, with a grant from the National health institutes of health. Common thread, the concrete, I use the architecture concrete material because it's long-lasting. I like the fact that when you see the exposed aggregate, that's the real stuff that's holding the cement together. So there's no veneer on the building. It's the real thing. I got the idea that wouldn't it be nice, since the purpose of the building was to take lives, really young lives, that are more or less been discarded, and to try to give them a boost and a head start. That was Nick's program, as a matter of fact, to try to make something worthwhile out of more or less discarded or lives that had been sort of passed over. Wouldn't that be nice to take materials that had been rejected and use them in a pretty way? Probably a good way to see some of these broken brick. These were all brick that had been done at Herbert Materials that had been put in a back lot in sort of a scrap pile. And we got them for next to nothing, I think, just for hauling them away. And we got them to lay up in sort of a non-pattern, rough texture, put the special coat on there, the epoxy coating, and it's still, 43 years later, they still look brand new. And no maintenance money has been spent on it. And so that was a victory. Very meaningful to me to use a discarded brick and make something positive out of it. That it reminds you of the purpose of the building is to make something positive out of those discarded lives. When Sue Gray and I went up to New York to interview Mr. Shawn to see if he would consider an artwork for the building, he was flattered, and we were amazed that he would even see us. This was his last work before he died, and he considered it his major work of his career, which I think is very interesting. It's a poem about the condition of mankind from Robert Locke. It's a glass mosaic that he designed, and it was executed in France, and the French technicians came over and installed it. Just before the Nazis took over in Germany, he came to the United States, and he's always been a social artist. His work was always for the underdog. Here it is written. It's a quotation from Robert Locke, and it's kind of nice. Shall I read it? So many are the links upon which the true philosophy depends, of which, if one be loose or weak, the whole chain is in danger of being dissolved. And it is to begin with the hands and eyes, and to proceed on through the memory, to be continued by the reason, nor is it to stop there, but to come to the hands and the eyes again. I can't do it without crying. He was a professor of psychology here at Peabody, and he got the idea of a thing called Head Start, which was revolutionary back in the 60s, where children would be given, preschool children would be given whatever advantages could be mustered for them to get them up to speed, so to speak, so they could compete at the regular level. And that was Nick's, and he was world famous for that. And what it is 2 days before he died, he called me and said how much he appreciated having my building named for him. When they dedicated the building out there, he made a very beautiful speech, and he said, that was well before he died, but he said, I really appreciate having this building so beautifully done by Neil Bass. And that was a very, very kind thing for him to say. But for him to do that just 2 days before he died was just amazing. To be thinking of me more than whatever. Yale had a very interesting program. I was very lucky to even get in. They had a skeleton faculty, and then they would bring in visiting lecturers. And so instead of at Harvard, they taught you how to do it. At Yale, it was the other way around. They would bring in people one day, one 6 weeks period, the guy would say, this is what I think. And then the next 6 weeks, another distinguished professor would come in, or architect would come in and tell you things that he thought were somewhat different. You were taught how to think, but not how to do. We had great teachers. Scully was one of the main influences in my whole life. He taught us architecture, philosophy, and history. And Gene Nall, who was the most dedicated teacher I've ever known, sort of a misfit, but he was in the drafting room, I guess 20 hours a day, every day. He never slept. And what we would do, we would always work after dinner. And you'd make a drawing, and then about 10:30 or so, you'd go home. Come back the next day, and he would have worked on your drawing. And I'd learn more from that. He would have worked on it and made the proportions more elegant, made the detailing more sensitive.
After you've made it
After I'd made the best I could, or was working on it, he'd come in and work. Oh man, what an opportunity that was. The other guy was King Louis Wu. He was on the faculty, a Chinese, and he just died recently. And he had a list of devoted students, but he used to say to me, Mr. Bass, he said, Mr. Bass, you must think in 3 dimensions. He would say, you must think in 3 dimensions. You know, and so it was all just an incredible experience, the whole thing. Bucky Fuller spent 2 years with us, but he was one of the world's great thinkers. And I'll never forget, I ran into him in Saks Fifth Avenue in New York, there on the ground floor, just in front of the escalators one day. This was a couple of years, well, this was 10 years after I'd graduated. I just happened to be in New York, happened to run into him. And there was a crowd, it was probably near Christmas, you know, thing. And I said, Mr. Fuller, and I reintroduced myself, and, oh, Neil, how are you? I said, those of us on planet Earth owe you a great debt. Aww. And people said, what? Who is this guy? You know, all the shoppers, you know, those of us on planet Earth, yeah, that's that was funny. Texture is one of the elements of design that you work with: light, shadow, texture, solid, void, all those things, proportion certainly. And then you get into that's one level. First, the lowest level is just to solve the problem, the functional problem. Then you look for statements with respect to proportions and scale and all that in the relationship of those sort of architectural things. And then you look for relationships beyond that with other buildings. And that's where the foreground-background concept comes in. I'm sure I've talked to you about that. Beyond that, there's the idea of relationship of a larger sort of environment with that's why houses are so hard, because most houses are on a street and you have to relate to the street. We're lucky here because we didn't have to do that. We just related to the site. And then the really highest level, there are two. The one where I'm talking about, this brick at Peabody. But then there's an even higher level, and that gets into the very nebulous realm of relationship to God and all that. And you try to make the buildings relevant to a greater sense of importance. That's hard. It's a dichotomy like in this house, and I think it works, to be a tranquilizing experience to walk through the house, at the same time an exciting experience. Well, you think that tranquilization and excitement are mutually incompatible, but they really aren't. I don't think. I think they can exist. But that, to me, is the premise by which I try to achieve a spatial experience. And the other thing is a linear thing. There's the idea of an entrance experience, right, and then the fulfillment experience, and there's sort of a journey through. As a matter of fact, King Louis Wu, that was a teacher of ours at Yale, used to say it's the path of the foot and the eye through the space. So that when you arrive at the visual conclusion of the experience, it's also the functional conclusion. If you can get those two things in harmony, preceded by an entrance experience and all that, it makes the whole thing kind of at a higher plane. So that's what I try to do.